Good morning, everybody. Okay, speed cameras. Hands up if you're a fan of speed cameras. There's quite a few of us here, that's good. There's an interesting presentation yesterday in the road safety session that showed that the people of Lithuania are big fans of speed cameras. Anyway, you missed that, it was good. So, I'm Richard Owen, I'm from Road Safety Analysis. I do need to mention the other authors, most notably Professor Richard Alsop, well known in the UK for a lot of his research into speed cameras over the last 20 years, and my colleague George Yosaki. So Road Safety Analysis, who are we? You'll have seen my colleague Dan yesterday, perhaps. Independent, not-for-profit organisation. We carry out research for governments, for local authorities, for private companies. This research was commissioned by the RAC Foundation. So, in order to understand the effectiveness of average speed cameras, we need to have a look at these different things. So we need to understand the history of speed cameras, need to know a little bit about our objectives, how we collected the data. Now, I understand that the presentation will be made available on the website after, and you can download a copy of the report from our website as well, roadsafetyanalysis.org. So before I talk about average speed cameras, you need to understand a little bit about the history of speed cameras in Great Britain. So we're big fans of speed cameras, largely installed because of casualty reduction reasons. And there were actually very strict criteria that were in place. So these are the requirements that we had before we could install any speed cameras in the UK. So there had to be a certain number of collisions, and there had to be speed as a causation factor, and we also had to have a look at the speed profiles as well. So it's a well-known approach that seems to be repeated around the world. So there was a government scheme that was set up to install lots of speed cameras, and the result was that speed cameras were incredibly popular across the UK. So here's an example of exactly how popular some of those speed cameras were with members of the public. So after millions of pounds worth of vandalism, the government decided that the public perhaps just weren't understanding how great speed cameras were. So what they did, they commissioned a series of reports, because of course members of the public read lots of reports, don't they, and then understand the reasons. So these reports weren't enough, sadly. But there were some reasons why the reports weren't satisfactory. The evidence appeared to be very good. 42% reduction in killed and seriously injured casualties at camera sites. That sounds like good news, doesn't it? We also looked at the difference between the fixed speed cameras and the mobile speed cameras. So you can see that the permanent ones had a slightly better result. But there was a problem with the data, and it was due to a statistical phenomenon called regression to mean. And this is where I try and explain regression to mean in 30 seconds. So if you imagine, we're talking about a stretch of road here, an imaginary stretch of road. And this is showing the average number of collisions per year along that stretch of road. So we can see they're more or less flatlining. Then for the next 3 years, imagine there's a big spike. And suddenly there's lots and lots of crashes at that location. And somebody like me would come along and go, oh, we need to put a speed camera there then, don't we? So I put the speed camera in, and the crashes go back down again. So look at the massive success I've achieved by putting in my speed camera. The problem is that we don't know whether those collisions would have disappeared anyway without me putting the speed camera in there. There were some calculations that were done using the empirical Bayes methodology that showed that actually this regression to mean phenomenon actually accounted for around 30% of the reduction that we saw at those fixed camera sites. So actually quite significant. Around a third of the collisions would probably have just disappeared anyway if I hadn't put that speed camera in there. So there's a slight gap in the knowledge, and over the last 10 years there's been a big increase in the use of average speed cameras in the UK. So the RAC Foundation set me a number of objectives to create a database of the average speed cameras in the UK, and then to have a look at control group and do some analytical research. We got hold of the data by speaking to the manufacturers, so 2 of the main manufacturers in the UK, Optic and 3M. But then we also had to speak to the local highway authorities. So there's hundreds of individual highway authorities in the UK. It's not just all controlled by the government. And then also have a look and see if we get some data from the police forces as well. And then, because we're an independent organisation, we carried out all of the analysis ourselves because we've got all of the collision data for the UK. So we weren't relying on potentially biased information from other authorities. There were some problems, though. We were quite rigorous. We decided to remove a quarter of the sites. So where there was examples of previous enforcement, where there was a change in the speed limit, or perhaps there'd been some fixed speed cameras that had been vandalised and they decided to put in some average speed, perhaps. So we had to remove those. So again, being very rigorous. Then we had to consider one of the problems of regression to mean and how could we control for this phenomenon. And what you can see on this chart here is a timeline for 3 sample sites. And it shows how the sites were selected. So you remember that spike that went up. We had to identify when the sites were selected so that we could remove that data and carry out a true analysis of the effect of the installation and not just the effect of the collision analysis. We then had to match all of the crashes on the road network. So we have a database of around 3 to 4 million crashes in the UK over the last 15 years. So we have quite a large database, and that enabled us to look over a very long period of time, a 15-year period. So you can see how we matched the collisions. We made sure that we didn't match ones on side roads, for example, because it's important that you only look at the crashes that occurred on the roads where the speed cameras were installed, not on adjacent roads. And then we also wanted to have a look at what was happening on other roads. And we've talked about regression to mean. The other big confounding factor is what is happening on the rest of the road network. So this is the city of Nottingham, which installed lots and lots of average speed cameras. So you can see all of those marked up in black and red there. But in my analysis, I wanted to have a look at what was happening on all of the other roads as well. What if collisions were reducing everywhere else at the same time? Surely that would account for some of the effect that we were seeing at the average speed camera sites. So all of the blue roads are all of the other main roads within Nottingham. And I wanted to have a look at those. So if I'd installed my speed cameras in Nottinghamshire, for example, and I'd seen a significant reduction in collisions, a 29% reduction in collisions, just for example, over a 15-year period, who thinks that would be a good casualty reduction? Who would like to reduce casualties by 30% on their roads? Yeah, and quite a few of you, I imagine. So if my camera had reduced those collisions by 29%, I would normally think that was a good idea. But actually, in the UK during that period, we saw that happening on all roads. It was happening for lots of different reasons. It was happening because of improvements in vehicle design, improvements in driver behaviour, increased compliance with the law. So lots of other things are happening, and we need to have a look at those within our data set as well. Then we, of course, need to have control sites. Every proper scientific experiment needs to have a control. So I picked some sample roads. Here's a wonderful road in England. I think it's in Derbyshire. Doesn't have a speed camera on it, so that's why it's quite popular. So we needed to have a look at other roads that didn't have speed cameras on to try and compare the effects there too. We chose ones where they were thinking about installing a speed camera but didn't actually do it. So, a semi-control site. So in terms of the increase in average speed cameras across the UK, this is what we've been seeing. So between 2000 and 2010, modest numbers. But really over the last few years, and 2016 is even higher. We've seen a much more roads covered and over a greater distance, largely because there's more competition in the market and the systems have become a lot cheaper. So that's what's been happening. Now, I'm sure you're interested in knowing what the results would look like. So if we just did a standard before and after analysis, we would see this 50% reduction again. So it's similar to what we saw with a national model from around 10 years ago. But I don't want to do that because I want to allow for regression to mean, etc. So we created this generalized linear model, which I'm sure you all instantly understand the formula in there, and you don't need me to explain that at all. I'm almost running out of time anyway. So I'll just move on from that and just explain that it looks at monthly data, takes into account the collisions on other roads, the site selection effect, and looks at the effect of the installation rather than all of the other confounding factors. So the results. I'm going to give you the first result. So this is what happened because of the site selection. This is the bias within the system. So whenever you or I select a road because it has a high collision rate, and certainly within these roads, that's the kind of effect that we saw. So there's already a 25% increase above what you would expect to see if you use a rigorous site selection methodology. So this applies to anything, not just speed cameras. It can be any kind of intervention that you undertake. So I think this is relevant not just for this study, but for other studies as well. And I would recommend that you carry out similar types of analysis on national schemes as well, just to make sure that you're isolating the effect of the intervention itself. So here is the installation effect. This is what we actually achieved when we stripped out all of the other effects that were happening at those camera sites. This is what we saw. So a 36.4% reduction in fatal and serious casualties, 16% reduction in PICs. That's basically all injuries. So we're seeing that speed cameras having a greater effect on reducing the more serious collisions, and a lesser effect on the more slight injury collisions. So if we're looking to, halve the number of road deaths anywhere, then you could say installing average speed cameras would get you a lot of the way towards your goal. We did have a look at some more detail, which you can see in the extensive report. We had a look at sites installed a long time ago versus more recently, no difference in effects. We also had a look at low versus high-speed sites because there are some, not many, some that are installed in urban areas, and it was found that they were just as effective as those installed in rural areas. And then the candidate sites, the ones that were going to have speed cameras installed, but they didn't end up doing it, they didn't see any change in the collisions. So my control sites didn't show a casualty reduction, which is great news, because that's exactly what you want to see in any of your analyses. So finally, what does this mean? Well, the presence of average speed cameras reduces the frequency of injury collisions, even when all of those other factors are taken into account. If you only take one thing away, apart from all the pictures of burnt speed cameras in the UK, if you only take one thing away, it's this: that average speed cameras reduce collisions. If you could take two things away, that would be good, which is that when you're analysing the impact of long-term road safety interventions, whatever it is that you're doing, changing speed limits, changing surfaces, you need to consider the effect of the general trend in the background. You can't claim that 100% of reductions that you see at your locations are because of the thing you did. I'm really sorry. There's something else that's always going on in the background, and if you can measure that, then you can analyze the effectiveness of your interventions. And thirdly, if you choose to use a selection criteria based on a high number of casualties, be aware that you are putting bias within your results. So if you select those sites based on the collision rates, some of those subsequent reductions would have happened anyway. Sorry, they would have happened anyway. Okay. With that, thank you very much.